I don't know how many of you follow what's going on in Washington, and generally I start my talks when I'm outside of Washington and say, I'm here from Washington, I'm here to help you. And this year I can actually say, I'm here from Washington, I'm here to help you with your budget. Because those of us who are subject to Congress, as the Institute is, were really on pins and needles last week before there was a budget deal made between the President and Congress. If that deal hadn't been made 11:30 Friday night, I would not be here today. And 800,000 federal workers and those who work for quasi-federal government institutions would have been furloughed this week without pay, which is not, of course, there are a lot worse things that can happen in life, but I would not have been here, and it would have been disruptive to a lot of the activities that we do and a lot of very important agencies of the federal government in the work that they're doing, particularly those who are working to promote peace. So I'm pleased that things worked out for the best. What I would like to do today is spend some time exploring the new frontiers of peace building in the context of current and future global challenges that we face as a society. I will weave into my remarks some of the work that USIP, the U.S. Institute of Peace, has undertaken, and at the end spend a little bit more time talking about the mission and our current activities. I will also talk a bit about the work of community colleges and how community colleges, also fondly referred to as democracies colleges, are contributing to building peace around the world. I would dare say that few of you have ever heard of the United States Institute of Peace. We will change that today, and hopefully at the end we can have a little bit of Q&A and can talk to you a little bit more about our work. Peace building is a rather awkward term. It is only recently that the word started to appear as a unified whole rather than two different words. Linguists will tell you that the merging of ideas and concepts into something new is represented through word construction. Remember when we had electronic mail, and then we had e-mail, and then we had email, right? So this is kind of an evolution. However, the arrival of a new word doesn't necessarily bring clarification of the word's meaning. In fact, that we still see peace building as two words might indicate a sense of hesitancy or tentativeness, or even a forced pairing like bringing oil and vinegar together. I suppose some of the awkwardness comes from the challenge of seeing peace as something that can be built or constructed. Peace, at least in the American context, is more seen as an end state or a state of being, often personal, frequently social, and certainly political. But led by the practitioner community, those people who work in the field, we have come to realize that peace is more verb than noun, more a process than an end, and more a journey than a destination. As such, we have brought to fruition A.J. Muskie's famous quote, "There is no way to peace, peace is the way." Peace building can be contrasted with other approaches common in the field. So we talk about conflict resolution, which is addressing the underlying causes of conflict, or conflict management, efforts to contain conflict, often in the international referred to as peacemaking. And then peacekeeping, which people frequently understand as when the blue helmets are deployed in conflict zones by the United Nations. As a global policy strategy, peace building is about 20 years old. It was in 1992 that the then United Nations Secretary General Boutros Boutros-Ghali, in his Agenda for Peace, defined peace building as a post-conflict strategy that would be needed if societies were to thrive after a war. Specifically, post-conflict peace building is, I quote, action to identify and support structures that will tend to strengthen and solidify peace in order to avoid a relapse into conflict. The agenda and the need for UN reform subsequently led to the UN Peacebuilding Commission and a whole range of other initiatives. Since then, however, many scholars and practitioners have found the post-conflict limitation as an unnecessary restriction and have urged peace building to be considered as a more system-wide approach that can be used as a prevention tool as well. Scholar practitioners such as John Paul Lederach, and those of you who work in the field or familiar with the field will know that he's a very internationally renowned, one of the fathers of the field, peacemaker, have argued for such a broader view. Recently, with a colleague at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at Notre Dame University, they developed a model that helps provide direction for those working in the field and think about the multiple ways they can contribute. Certainly one of the questions, particularly with the young people in the room, is probably, how can I even develop a peace career? How can I do this, even say beyond the things that I'm doing in the classroom, to even transcending working for invisible children, going beyond that? What are some of the things that I can do? These strategic peace-building paths, as they call them, start with a core representing the major thrusts of peace building. So if you think of peace building as a field, you have three major components. Structural and institutional change is making changes in a society that's long-lasting, to government, to entities, and so forth. Justice and healing, for instance, after a civil war, after a conflict, the necessity of reconciling, bringing people together, a truth and reconciliation process, for instance. And then finally, violence prevention, conflict response, and transformation. That often includes things like conflict resolution, the things that you do to bring people together. From this inner core, an outer circle represents the applied work of the field, which takes a holistic view: education, development, restorative justice, trauma healing, nonviolent social change. The International Center for Nonviolent Conflict is here today, so they're really authorities on the idea of nonviolent social change, and conflict resolution strategies, etc. And I have actually a chart I could make copies of it and show you what we're talking about. This paints a picture of peace building that can be viewed as a maintenance strategy in any society, one frayed by conflict, but one that is seemingly peaceful, take our own, and to assist that society in achieving the aspirations of its people. Looking at the landscape of challenges facing us today and in the future, peace building will need to be more malleable, more creative, and more importantly, quick responding, something that it has not always been, to effectuate its aims. Though a need will continue for deployment of the UN Blue Helmets and other more policy-oriented means of conflict engagement, there increasingly will be need for more innovative strategies and approaches. One of my colleagues at the Institute noted the emergence of networked threats. So characterized by even tighter webs of linking people around the world, these include threats that come from internet viruses that can promote havoc in the financial and communication sectors. New cyber world opportunities for instability are ever present for disgruntled, criminal, ideological-based, and fanatical groups seeking to promote instability and terrorism. While we struggle with how to respond to these new vulnerabilities, globalization and the increasing movement of peoples, either a result of war, or natural disaster, or due to the ease in borders, or just the availability of transportation means, will continue to make our world vulnerable to things like global pandemics and certainly acts of terrorism. All of these new threats have one overriding thing in common: their speed and immediacy. A tsunami and earthquake in Japan, a global internet virus, a bombing in a subway station in London. We don't get warnings for these and an array of other forms of instability and violence. Gone are the days when we could watch troop and arm movements and see what might happen. Remember the Cuban Missile Crisis, when US military reconnaissance and intelligence was able to see the movement of Soviet atomic weapons. We still need that type of intelligence, but increasingly movements will be quick and self-like. It's interesting that we as a nation are commemorating the 150th anniversary of the Civil War this year. And it may not be so relevant in California, but I'm from Maryland, and about a third of the Civil War was fought kind of 50 miles from my home. Today, in fact, is the anniversary of the death of Abraham Lincoln, if you don't know that. He died this day in 1865. And also, at this day in 1861, the federal troops at Fort Sumter were surrendered the day before, and Abraham Lincoln made a general call to arms, calling people in the North to enlist to fight in what was then going to be our greatest national struggle. It is interesting, as I was saying, to think that at that time you could watch armies and armies needed to move thousands of troops, often over long distances by foot. Because of the importance of this buildup of armies and the time that it took, people could leisurely plan to watch war from their rooftops. If you read about the first Battle of Manassas in Virginia and even the bombing of Fort Sumter, one of the things that's striking is that people went in their carriages in their best Sunday dress in the distance to watch what was going on. We don't do that today, clearly. So how does peace building respond to this new reality and do so without giving up its overriding aim to promote structural long-term stability? How does a community get ahead of new threats and order and peace promulgated by warmongers, autocrats, Bush commanders, and also internet hacks and biological and ideological terrorists? The key lies in prevention and doing a better job, albeit with new challenges, in anticipating instability. Here are a couple things to consider. One, perpetrators of violence today will increasingly be thoughtful planners who will harness the new technologies of this age. We will still have our primitive Joseph Kones who terrorize Africa and enslave child soldiers. Even Joseph Kone uses a bit of technology, but certainly not to the degree other people do. But increasingly, those determined to undermine stability will have advanced education or be insisted by those with such education. Cyber terrorism, for instance, requires much planning, networks, collaboration, and a sophisticated knowledge of information technology. Even violence that is physical and brutal requires a high level of planning. No one has suggested that Al-Qaeda is not a planful operation. As such, peace builders using prevention strategies must be as planful in their work. We do that now, of course, in terms of looking at the sources and causes of conflict. We urge our partners, those of us in the peace building field, our partners in the security and law enforcement worlds, to seek our knowledge and understanding. But we have to do more, urge more, and take our own steps. This may sound like a shift from peace building to peace intelligence, but today's world will require that we get into the heads of those forces of violence. We will need to be prepared to work quickly and efficiently, to take a rapid reaction approach to intervention at times in the cause of preventing conflict. This is not something we've always been good about. We have argued that peace building is a long-term proposition, and it is. But often, we take much too long to engage in the beginning of the long term. Of course, assessment understanding what we can and cannot do is important. But as we see, for instance, in working with child soldiers in post-conflict environments, the window of opportunity is a small one. As an aside, in looking at the wonderful work of Invisible Children, what you should know is the major thrust in working with child soldiers is in the post-conflict environment, in DDR, what happens afterwards. Well, most therapists and scholars and practitioners tell you it's a 30-day window of opportunity. Once you demobilize a child soldier, if within 30 days you cannot put them into reintegration and education, a post-traumatic stress disorder program, you've lost them. And today, in Liberia and Sierra Leone, in conflicts that are now 10 and 15 years old, you have former child soldiers who are roaming the streets, carrying AK-47s, women who have not been able to find the work and get into the projects that we were talking about and are working the streets because we were not rapid enough to go back in those societies and take action before it was too late. 2, realize that the new instruments of conflict and violence will be used in more sophisticated and unpredictable ways. Traditional arms and weapons have very predictable uses. But can you predict the multiple ways in which the internet can be used to create instability? Likewise, do we know all the ways in which these new technologies can be used for peace? The ways in which social networking, such as Facebook, Twitter, and then websites, can be used for good and for bad are unimaginable. Consider Egypt. It was the absence of the internet and the inability to socially connect, brought about by the internet being shut down by the government, that actually brought people into the streets. We need creative minds, including those that are not conflict professionals, but are IT professionals, who can anticipate the disruptive ways in which technology can be used and can create peace-building strategies that can be sustainable. 3, We must take a maintenance-oriented view to peace building. Because of limited resources and, more importantly, limited political will and public attention, peace building tends to be responsive in nature rather than proactive. We as a society generally don't react until there's blood in the streets. And blood in the streets is what makes the New York Times. Think of your car. If you know that you're having problems with your engine or your tires or whatever, isn't it better to have a mechanic intervene early rather than waiting for the $3,000 engine replacement bill? If we took the same long view of peace building as something that needs to be applied continuously in a society, even one that is maybe not even on the verge of conflict, then in the long run we will save time and resources. Recently, the Institute for Economics and Peace, the group that launched the Global Peace Index in 2007, and I would urge you to go to their website because some very interesting information about the Global Peace Index, where they rate all countries around the world as to their level of violence, produced a Global Peace Index for the US, ranking the violence levels in all 50 states. California rated 33rd, which means there are 32 states that are more peaceful than California. The Institute argues that the total cost of loss of productivity in the US because of violence is nearly $100 billion. It argues that lower levels of violence can result in initial savings to states and governments of $65 billion. Peace can save money. Peace can help balance the budget. Number 4, finally, we need to explore the intersections of how peace-building strategies can be valuable in promoting stability in new ways. Too often we develop a bit of isolation from other disciplines. At least I would say academics do that. Trying to see the field apart as distinctive and trying to make it credible. We scoff at the idea that peace building should be mainstreamed into other fields and suggest that these other fields mainstream into the peace field. But the reality is that peace building limitations come from the inability to make the case for its utility across the spectrum of fields, industries, government, etc. While academic programs continue to be established in peace, such as the program here at Golden West, increasingly conflict resolution and peace building is being incorporated into an array of other areas, including business, public health, development, and traditional liberal arts, such as political science and psychology. In many institutions today, taking a course in conflict resolution or management or peace building means taking a course in international business and looking at the best ways that a business can work in cultural environments. Or public health and examining how best to promote practices that reduce the possibilities of conflict. At USIP, we have accepted peace building as the umbrella term to describe our work, be it focused on prevention, conflict intervention, or post-conflict capacity building. We view peace building as the broad way of describing what we do. In looking at the 4 challenges I just suggested, USIP engages in efforts that have attempted to anticipate these needs. So let me talk about these 4 responses briefly. Through our centers of media, conflict and peace building, and science, technology, and peace building, we are actively engaged in exploring how social media and new technologies can be used to promote peace. We have examined how mobile phones are promoting peace building in Afghanistan, developed a television show for Iraqi youth that focuses on peace building, and established a peace media clearinghouse to provide a hub of media-related resources that can be used in the classroom, used by NGOs, by teachers, by governments, all in the field. We are exploring how blogs and tweets are being used and will be used to promote peace and foster nonviolent revolution and change. Annually, we host an event that brings together eminent journalists, both those using traditional print means, but increasingly those that are using the new technologies. 2, as an institution, USIP is using technology as a means of getting our message out. We are on Facebook. We have clips on YouTube. At our events, which are webcasts, we are tweeting and blogging. We have developed extranets focusing on specific content that it relates to specific communities. Number 3, as maintenance is a form of prevention, we have closely looked at states and societies on the verge of collapse. Our Center for Conflict Analysis and Prevention designs and manages our efforts to prevent the outbreak of violent conflict. The center conducts analysis of countries and regions where the threats to peace and stability are particularly acute. And many of these places are places you've never heard of because they're in the prevention stage. They're not on the front page of the newspaper. The center develops new tools for anticipating and preventing violent conflict. We are currently working, for instance, in places that maybe you have heard of: Iran, Pakistan, Kenya, Lebanon, and Zimbabwe. But there are many others that you haven't heard of. And number 4, finally, looking at the intersections of conflict and peace and other emerging fields is something that the U.S. Institute of Peace has strongly supported. We have a number of centers of innovation which looks and considers these gaps. In our Center for Sustainable Economies, we research best practices and develop new peace-building tools for professionals working on issues related to economics and conflict and the management of peace promotion. A recent innovation included the International Network for Economics and Conflict, a comprehensive tool for practitioners of economic development working in fragile states. Our Center of Law Innovation Center develops new tools for policymakers and practitioners working to promote the rule of law, working at improving legal systems in post-conflict environments. It has played a significant role in shaping the field and advancing the rule of law in fragile societies such as Iraq and Afghanistan. And we have centers on gender and peace building, security sector reform, religion and peacemaking, and I already mentioned to you about technology and media. Let me talk a little bit about community colleges. With 1,200 institutions enrolling nearly 45% of U.S. undergraduates, and when I talk to non-community college audiences, they're often surprised to hear that 45% of U.S. undergraduates figure. Community colleges represent the higher education of choice for the largest range of Americans, and especially those arriving recently to our shores. Because of the overwhelming diversity, the innovation, and the broad mission of community colleges, they would seem logical venues to address issues of global peace and conflict. Surprisingly, it is only recently that community colleges got into the game. 5 years ago, only a handful of community colleges were examining peace as a programmatic way, this college being one of them. Today, there are nearly 40 around the United States. Much of the efforts have been as a result of the work that we have done at USIP to build capacity with community colleges. Through a range of strategies, including faculty development seminars, consultations, programs for students, and publishing, we have been able to seed an array of programs and support the efforts of programs that are already there, such as the one here at Golden West. Today, community colleges are developing degree and certificate programs, hosting non-credit and community activities, such as this peace conference. In fact, there are peace conferences in 7 or 8 community colleges that I know of around the U.S. Engaging students in experiential activities, such as Model UN, and using international education and partnering as a means for examining global peace issues. Much needs to be done, but this college and others are on the cutting edge of providing Americans a venue for engaging in important discussions of war and peace at democracy's colleges. Let me end by telling you just a few things with USIP, and then I can take questions. With offices, we have offices in Baghdad and Kabul, in addition to our new headquarters in Washington, D.C. USIP is a think, act, teach, and train entity that seeks to build peace worldwide. Founded in 1984, USIP was established as an independent, nonpartisan entity with a presidentially appointed board of directors. USIP thinks by supporting the work of scholars through our Jennings Randolph Fellows Program and our USIP Press, which publishes a wide range of textbooks and publications for practitioners and academics. USIP acts by providing grants to NGOs and others to support peace-building activities in conflict zones. Many of our grants are for work in the most serious conflicts we're facing: Iraq, Afghanistan, and other conflicts that you know about, and maybe those that you don't know about, such as in Sudan and to some extent Pakistan. Increasingly, our funds are being used in prevention applications to intervene early to prevent a serious outbreak of violence. USIP teaches by sponsoring a national peace essay contest, where each year nearly 1,200 US high school students answer questions of global importance. Recent questions have focused on nonviolent social action, nonviolent strategic action, nuclear non-proliferation, the intersection of natural resource and conflict. And the question this year will look at the new technologies, including social media, and how they can be used to promote peace. We also teach by working with community colleges around the US and four-year institutions. We have worked with, in my own work, with nearly 150 colleges in the US in trying to promote peace and conflict resolution. And finally, the Institute trains by working with NGOs and civil society around the world in trying to promote their work in trying to build peace in their own societies. Recently, we established an Academy of Conflict Management specifically designed for training State Department, NGO, and military people as they engage around the world. In closing, recently, the U.S. Institute of Peace moved to a new headquarters in the National Mall. If you go to Washington, I urge you to consider stopping and visiting. We are now located just north of the Lincoln Memorial. In September, we will officially dedicate our space on September 21st, which is the International Day of Peace. Part of our building will include a global peace building center, designed as an education space, a visual space, a pace of learning for all Americans and certainly anyone, internationals, anyone who comes to Washington, learn about the work of global peace building. It'll provide activities, it'll provide insight. One of the issues that it will look at is the child soldier issue. So I invite you to come to Washington and visit us. I invite you to learn more about the work of the Institute. I have information in the back table there about USIP. And I urge you to continue the good work that you're doing today here at Golden West. Those of you who are working, as I always urge people to work in, they can do small steps in big ways in the things that you're doing every day to promote peace in your own communities. Thank you very much. So if we have more time, I know we're on the clock and I don't want to, I know keeping the trains running on time is very important when you have a one-day conference. But I am open to taking questions about the work of USIP. I can tell you a little bit, I thought maybe I would do is just give you a little bit more of the historical background of the Institute. Like I said, now I'm going to test myself here. How many people in the room, by show of hands, have ever heard of the United States Institute of Peace? Well, that's good. Well, you're a peace community. You're well informed. So I saw about 10 hands go up. So let me give you a little bit historical snapshot of the Institute, and then any questions that you might have. I go around the U.S., as I say, talking about the Institute, and all too frequently, people come to me and said, I never heard of the U.S. Institute of Peace. That's the first question. Second question is, you're not doing a very good job. We are in 2 wars, maybe 2.5 wars if you count Libya now. And yeah, it does sound like that. I would suggest we are doing a very good job, but it may not show itself as a result of what we're doing in Afghanistan and Iraq all the time. The idea of a peace office or a peace establishment was something that was originally proposed by George Washington in 1783. He sent a circular to the states saying, should we establish a peace establishment? Should we have a peace establishment? Now, we're not really sure what he meant, but many people thought at the time that he really meant setting up some sort of a training or education place where people could learn and be taught how to engage in international work, because we focus on international work, in promoting peace without going to war. Realize in 1783, we are just coming out of a revolutionary war and about ready to start our great experiment in democracy. Benjamin Banneker, Benjamin Rush, other early thinkers at the time also recommended an institute. In the 19th century, we had the establishment of our military academies. We spent a lot of times fighting Spanish-speaking people, war against Mexico in the first part of the century, and war against Spain in the second part of the century. And in the middle of the century, we fought each other. So it was really, the 19th century was a century of war. It really wasn't until the 1970s that there was a national groundswell, a grassroots movement. It was called the National Peace Academy campaign, of Americans who felt after Vietnam that we really needed to once again think about how Americans are engaging around the world. and providing a training, teaching opportunity for young people especially in learning the ways of peace. At the same time, there was movement within Congress. In 1975, Mark Hatfield and some other senators proposed the George Washington Peace Academy. Legislation didn't make it very far, but in 1979, Jimmy Carter, as president, appointed a commission to consider the U.S. Academy of Peace, as it was called then, called the Matsunaga Commission. Anybody here from Hawaii? Well, anybody know who Spark Matsunaga was? Probably those of you who are in my generation know he was a senator, Japanese-American senator from Hawaii, had fought in World War II and felt very strongly that this country should be committed to looking at nonviolent approaches to resolving conflicts. And the Matsunaga Commission held hearings around the United States over 18 months, made recommendations for an academic institution. In 1981, the report went to Congress. We had a different president in 1981, Ronald Reagan. The proposal for the commission, well, you know the adage about you don't really want to learn how sausage is made. Because once you learn about how sausage is made, you never eat it. And that's the way kind of Congress operates. 1984, the bill to establish the U.S. Institute of Peace. From then, we had gone from a purely academic institution to something that looked more of a think and an applied tank with some educational programming, but much broader, looking at a whole range of things. Made it through Congress and was signed into law in 1984. We were a rider, an amendment of the Defense Authorization Bill of that year. And Ronald Reagan signed us into law. We started operating in 1986 with a staff of 3. Today we have a staff of 325. Our first program was the National Peace Essay Contest, which we've been now running for over 26 years. As I was saying, most Americans don't know our work, and it's because for the last 27 years, we've operated very quietly, and we operate in zones of conflict around the world. The work that we do is often very applied, very in the streets. It focuses mostly on what we call track 2 negotiations. We're not working at the highest levels of government. We're working within society, within civil society, with the sheikhs in Iran, with the religious, with the women in Sudan, with the educators in Israel or Palestine. We're working in those communities to try to bring people together in order to promote a strategy for peace building. Probably about 10 years ago, we were given permission by Congress to consider building a headquarters. We were given a piece of property next to the State Department, and we started building 7 years ago, or maybe 6 years ago. And we just occupied our building 2 weeks ago. So we're now on the mall, and most people walk by and say, gee, I never knew there was a U.S. Institute of Peace. We've been around for a while, but now that people see us, they really know who we are and the work that we're doing. Like I said, we're not a very big organization, 325 employees roughly. We have a budget, well, our budget was just decided within the last couple of days, I guess, depending on how you look at it. In this fiscal year of 2011, we budget $39.5 million. I say million, not billion, not trillion. Our budget is 1/10 of 1% of the State Department budget. Our budget is very small. So, with that, we have a little bit of better understanding of what the Institute does. Questions that anybody might have about our activities, please.
What has the USIP successfully implemented in post-conflict areas, and what issues have you faced in those areas?
Let me mention some major things that we've done, and then maybe look at some specific conflicts and what we're doing in those conflicts. As I said, we work in conflict zones, and we work on international conflict issues. Having said that, we have been asked at times by Congress and outsiders to engage in more grander projects. How many people here are familiar with the Iraq Study Group? The Iraq Study Group report came out in 2006. We were asked by members of Congress to look at Iraq. The war was not going well. And a commission was appointed. We basically organized the commission, ran the commission's activities. It was the Baker-Hamilton Commission. Jim Baker, who was a Republican Secretary of State in the Bush 41 administration. Lee Hamilton, which was a Democratic member of Congress who was head of the Woodrow Wilson Center, made recommendations to Congress and the President after a year, and the recommendations were things like, we should be talking to Syria, we should be talking to Iran, we should be using more diplomacy, we're not going to get out of Iraq what we're doing right now. So a lot of people know about us in there. Let me talk about a couple things we're doing. Talk about Iraq first of all, because we've been in Iraq the longest. We've all been in Iraq a long time, I guess, as a country. One of their most recent programs, we have a lot of things going on in Iraq. We have an office in Baghdad where we run programs. Realize also that we give away 25% of our funding to grants, predominantly to non-governmental organizations around the world that are doing peace-building activities. So the International Center for Nonviolent Conflict, I think they've been granted by us. We've been working with them for a long time. And it was the Institute actually that funded a lot of the early work in nonviolent strategic action. The book, A Force More Powerful, which many of you who are on the nonviolence end of the work, you're probably very familiar with that book and the video that came out of it that talks about these various scenarios where nonviolent action was used. That was a US IP product. In Mohammedia, which is an area south of Baghdad called the Triangle of Death, we were asked by the 10th Mountain Division. Now, one of the things you should know about the Institute is that we work with military, we work with NGOs, we work with diplomats. In this case, the military came to us and said, this is a very dangerous part of Iraq, we're losing a lot of death. So we convened a group of 31 sheikhs over the course of several months, had a conference. The sheikhs developed 39 principles of how to get along with each other, and the level of violence went down, down, down. And this is the type of stuff that we've done in Iraq and all parts of the world. Getting people together, getting religious people together in order to look at things differently. In Afghanistan, we set up a network of Afghani facilitators to go around the country. We often do train the trainers. So we trained Afghanis to resolve their own conflict. One of the things that's important for us is that we don't come in with the notion that we have the answers. We come in to try to support what people are already doing in their communities. The Institute, and I personally believe that the answer to resolving conflict almost always is within the society themselves. There are traditional processes, there are traditional ways, often these processes have been obliterated for various reasons, that we need to help people find themselves. Often this is a reconciliation, a healing process. We're talking about child soldiers. You know, one of the things that people should know is that the reintegration of a child soldier back into his community is one of the toughest things that you can imagine. And one of the things that we realize is that the communities themselves have their own cleansing processes, their own ways of doing things that we need to help communities find in order to have a child soldier go back into that community and be accepted again. So in Afghanistan, we set up this network of Afghani facilitators. Sudan is a place we've worked a lot in, and those of you who've been following international politics know that in July the 1st, we will have a new country, and it's the Republic of South Sudan. I don't know how many people are aware of that and following that. It's very significant. I don't think we've had a new country since East Timor, so it's been a number of years. And we've been in Sudan for 5 years, and actually we were one of the few entities that were in Sudan that was in there training people in order to resolve their conflicts without using violence. In January, we spent a lot of time in Sudan and in the last part of the year working with groups within the society in order to how to prevent electoral violence. Now, one of the things that if you follow geopolitical issues, know that often when you have elections bring about a lot of violence. In Africa, unfortunately, this is the case more often than not, as we saw in Kenya several years ago. So one of the things we didn't want to have happen in Sudan was the same thing, so we spent a lot of time doing that. There are probably 7 or 8 other conflict zones around the world I could talk about and things that we've done in particularly in those conflict zones. A lot of the work, like I said, is with educators. A lot of it is increasingly with new forms of media. We've funded documentaries on the conflict in Nepal. We have helped the peace process in Sri Lanka. We work to build peace in Colombia, places that we're not always cognizant that there's violence going on. We work in a lot of societies that are pre-conflict. We're looking a lot at prevention and trying to work in the society so that you never hear about them. So I'm giving you a long answer. So, yes, ma'am.
How about Iran?
I'm sorry?
How about Iran?
Iran's a hard country to work on, and it's a good question. Iran actually is one of our priority conflicts. So for instance, we have countries that we have said we want to give more projects in that country than other countries. Iran is one of them. The challenge is you can't work inside of Iran. So we've generally been working with diaspora communities, Iranian Americans and other communities, and trying to promote discourse. For instance, we're spending time kind of understanding and studying the use of social networking. The revolution didn't come to the fruition it wanted to in Iran that took place several years ago was all a technology revolution in many respects. So how do we understand that in order to support that? I don't know specific programs we're doing in Iran, but if you emailed me, if you go to our webpage and you were to put up Iran, you'd see then all the lists of things that we've been supporting in Iran. A lot of it is through grants. Other questions? Yes, right here. Yes, yes, ma'am.
Do you believe the U.S. is truly helping bring peace to the Middle East, or do you think we're kind of getting in the way?
I think one of the things that, I think that's a very good question, first of all, and I think it's one of the questions that I think is a bit of a paradox and about our form of government and the way we operate. Realize USIP is not really part of the federal government also, we're outside of that loop. But, when people say, what's the US doing? And, there's no unified answer. What do you mean the US? Do you mean NGOs? Do you mean academia? Do you mean the White House? I mean, everyone is doing different things, and this is often a difficult thing for internationals to understand, because if you go to many parts of the country, everybody's on the same page. They're not on the same page, they're shipped out to a prison somewhere, right? So everybody's doing different things, so I'm often, how can we be working on peace in Iraq when we're at war in Iraq at the same time, right? And it does seem to be complex. I really can't answer the question of why we're at war in Iraq, because we're not a policy rendering institution. That's kind of a comment on US policy. I'm actually prevented from doing that. But what I would tell people is that our society operates in different ways, and you would see the Peace Corps and USAID, which probably are on the same side of the balance sheet that we are. The US Agency for International Development. Development is a tremendous tool of peace building around the world. We're in these conflict zones. USAID is in many of these places, trying to build communities, build markets, give loans. The Peace Corps is not in Iraq, but Peace Corps is in other places. So we're doing that. At the same time, we've got troops on the ground. One of the things that I would say is that, and this is to understand a bit about the military in the United States, I would urge people to look at the military and understand that the military itself is under a transformative period. That we as an institute, one of the things that we have been surprised at in the last 4 or 5 years is the number of military people that come to us and say, we don't know how to negotiate. We don't know about peace processes. We don't know about culture. Can you train some of us in order to understand these things? Right? So one of the things that we do is that we're doing a lot to support the military. Realize the American military often is not viewed the same way as other militaries. I mean, when you're seeing blue helmets, you're seeing Swedes or you're seeing Canadians, and that's truly a peace mission. The United States hasn't done a lot of that, but I think we're transforming our military to do those kind of things. I'm going to comment a little bit more on one other end on the military, just to kind of show you, and this to connect in the importance of community colleges. Everyone here is probably familiar with Abu Ghraib. What happened in Abu Ghraib. What you might not know is that the soldiers that did the bad things in Abu Ghraib were National Guardsmen. They were from Western Maryland, and half of them graduated from community colleges. I would say, there is no institution in America that is more impacted by the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan than American community colleges. Absolutely. I go to community colleges, and there is a base next door. There are military families. There are guys in fatigues. There are gals in fatigues. Community colleges are teaching courses in community colleges. That's what community colleges do. I would argue that those students who had gone to that community college, and there's another part of that story, if they had learned in a course, in a peace studies program, about human rights and the Geneva Convention, would Abu Ghraib have happened? Maybe not. Maybe still, but less likely. That community college that produced some of the students I subsequently went to, and they now have a peace studies program. One of the things that I would urge people in community colleges, particularly to be cognizant of where people go from community colleges and the impact that you can have here in teaching about peace. If you can offer a course in human rights, I mean, my best world is everybody is required to take a peace studies course before they graduate. And everybody is required to take a course in human rights before they graduate. Okay? And everybody walks out knowing about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Geneva Convention. And so every military person who comes here who signs up then down the streets and gets shipped out to be a private first class in the Army knows that there's a Geneva Convention, that's right. And what we're doing here is wrong. And I maybe better tell my lieutenant because this doesn't make sense to me. We can't assume that building peace and creating more humane ways of even operating in war situations is always up to the responsibility of officers. So I would urge continuing to work in community colleges. So I'm kind of taking off your question a little bit.
Another question?
Yes, yes ma'am.
I'm going to bounce off of her comment. It seems what you're saying is we've got different entities in the United States that move in different directions at the same time, as can be witnessed, like you say, on the continent of Africa, where planes flew over Libya, which I believe is a result of what happened in Tunisia, what happened in Egypt, but no plane flew over the Ivory Coast, where those people legally elected their leader.
Right.
They received no help
Right.
from the
Right.
dictator.
Right.
What kind of peace-building strategy did you implement there?
Well, a couple things I'll say. And one of the things is that we have a national kind of disinterest, unfortunately, in Africa, and it comes through our national policies. And this is very unfortunate. And I think, I could be here a long time talking about Africa and colonialism, and understanding that the conflict in Côte d'Ivoire and the Ivory Coast is also a religious conflict. You take the line and go through the center of Ivory Coast in Nigeria and Sudan, it's Christian, Muslim, and so forth. The conflict in Ivory Coast, look, let me talk about Libya. This is my understanding of Libya. Why the president decided to commit air power to Libya was that innocent lives were being slaughtered by the Gaddafi government. Yes, and that could happen in Ivory Coast. I'm not suggesting that, but that did happen. That did happen, right. So that's what was going on there. So that's why we engaged in Libya. Now, if you think there was an ulterior agenda, that's your right to think that. Now that whole campaign's been handed over to NATO. We're still playing a role in it. And I think the president was very sensitive about not being there. Côte d'Ivoire and Ivory Coast, who's taking the lead there is the French, because it's a former French colony. One of the things that I would say is that we shouldn't be taking the lead everywhere. The United States should not be everywhere. That is where, and the question is, the French are getting in trouble in Côte d'Ivoire because who actually detained Gbagbo? The president, Laurent Gbagbo, was it the French or the Ivorians? We're not even sure. But in a sense, as an international community, you may say the US should be there, but the US government was saying the French were there, and the French have been there. I'm not saying they did everything they should be, but I'm also suggesting we shouldn't be everywhere all the time. We need to pick and choose. And even with Libya, the lead in Libya now is between the French and the British. It's not with the Americans anymore. We're in 2 wars. We've never fought 2 wars. So we need to be selective. But what we have to do is that we need to get other countries around the world stepping up to the plate when there's genocide, when there's slaughter taking place, so that it's not always the United States, and we're starting to get that. I don't know if I'm satisfying your answer, because I do know that we do neglect Africa and we continue to do that, but I also know a bit of, I think, what the justification was in Côte d'Ivoire.
And your phrase, innocent people,
right,
is in fact why I'm not satisfied at all, because innocent people were killed in the Ivory Coast, were killed before the election, were killed during the election,
right,
were killed when the man said, the Americans are wrong, I won, and I'm not going anymore.
Right. Yeah, I can't.
Libyans, the innocent people in Libya are more valued than the innocent people in Ivory Coast, because everybody knew.
Right, I can look. Ivory Coast, you want to talk about conflict, just go next door to Nigeria. How come we're not more active in Nigeria? How come the United States is in northern Uganda? How come the United States, there was a lot of violence in Kenya after the last election? We could be looking at a lot of Africa, and I think that's a collective issue for Americans. And how come we didn't stop Rwanda? You know, I can't speak for U.S. policy. I'm perplexed by it myself.
But I was asking, did you do anything in Ivory? What kind of peace building?
That we're doing?
Yeah.
I don't know if we're doing anything directly. I know we've written a lot of what we do is research. So I've got a couple colleagues who have been in Ivory Coast, have studied the conflict in Ivory Coast, and I think we're probably funding some NGOs that are working in Ivory Coast, but it isn't something that we are directly engaged in. Once again, it isn't, I think in some respects, people didn't anticipate the violence that took place in Ivory Coast. Maybe going back several years. I mean, there was a civil war in Ivory Coast going back, but, and once again, I'm not excusing anyone, but it's not a priority conflict that we've done. But if you email me, I'll find out what we're doing in Ivory Coast, and I'll give you information about it. And if you go to our website and put in Côte d'Ivoire, you'll find out what we're doing in Ivory Coast. Most people use the word Côte d'Ivoire when they talk about Ivory Coast. Yes, ma'am?
My question is, why is it anyone's responsibility? If I fight with my neighbor or whatever, why should it become her responsibility to cure my problem? So why are we not thinking of peaceful things, even in conflict resolution and everything, how to establish people so that they can live peacefully with each other and not have to ask other people to solve our problems?
Well, that's a very important question. I think it's very critical. People in many societies, because of the... Okay, so why are we responsible for each other? Why aren't we getting people to solve their own conflicts? In many societies are so battered, so frayed, so marginalized that they don't have the capacity. The wonderful work that the Invisible Children are doing, that's an American program working in northern Uganda. People would say, well, let the Ugandans figure it out. But there's no capacity to do that there. So the international community, I believe, has an international obligation to help societies in that way. And what we need to do is we need to help them help themselves. So that's the intention, I think, today. It isn't that we want to be forever in a society. We want to help those societies help and figure out what they can be doing. Look, ultimately, what happens to Joseph Kone, all right, is President Museveni and the Ugandan government is going to have to deal with that at some point, not the international community. There is the International Criminal Court has brought charges against Kone. He's going to be in the bush until the charges are dropped, probably. I mean, this is very complex looking at that country. But that country itself needs to deal with it, not the rest of us. But having said that, under things like Chapter 6 and Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter and under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we are part of the international community. And when things are going on, I personally, this is my personal, we can't be isolationists. We have to engage, but we have to, how do we engage and how much is an important question.
David, we have two questions back here.
Yes, you point them out to me because I'm not seeing that far. With the microphone.
Does the Institute of Peace have a presence in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? And if so, how does the government's strategies influence you?
We've been working in Israel-Palestine since the beginning. And generally we've been working in the educational sphere in Israel-Palestine. So a lot of what we've done is working, for instance, we brought Palestinian and Israeli teachers together. You know, one of the issues understand that we work at this lower tier, and we're trying to make change that's sustainable. So for instance, look at Israel-Palestine. In many parts of the world, including Israel-Palestine, what holds the conflict and people's attention is people's faithfulness to history. Americans are very, we don't remember history. You can talk about the Civil War, right? Talk about how people are now reconstructing the history of the Civil War, right? And I'm getting a little personal here, but I'm a little concerned when I hear people talking about it was states' rights and it wasn't really slavery, and then there's a secessionist ball in South Carolina and so forth. And most people don't. You ask American high school students about the Civil War, they wouldn't remember. You ask Israeli and Palestinian students about the conflict, they'll go back 2,000 years. You ask people in the Balkans, they'll talk about the Battle of Kosovo in 13 whatever. History ties people. Now, history is taught. History is taught through textbooks. So one of the things that we've done in places like Israel-Palestine is looking at the narratives that teachers are using, that Palestinians that demonize Israelis and Israelis that demonize Palestinians. How do you change that? So we're working with educators so that they're working from one page. In many places of the world, for instance, one of the efforts and things that we fund is looking at textbooks and rewriting textbooks. People say, well, that's not the big thing. It is the big thing. Because if you can't get young people in 7th grade to view the other as a person rather than a demon, you're lost. So in Israel-Palestine, a lot of our work has been with educators. That's what we have found the most success in, to answer your question. And if you go to our webpage, that could point out more programs we've done there.
I thought of a question. There was another question over
Yes,
here.
sir. Yes, sir.
It got answered. I'm interested in what you can tell us about the Department of Peace as a facet of the cabinet. What will your organization have anything to do with that? Do you know if that's something that we'll see soon? Is it in the development, or is it just something that people talk about?
Well, here's the official line. That's a policy issue. We can't take policy stances. And I can't tell you, I can't. The Department of Peace and the U.S. Institute of Peace are totally separate notions. The Department of Peace is legislation proposed by Congressman Kucinich, who's a great friend of the Institute. And I have very good friends in the U.S. Department of Peace movement that is asking to establish a cabinet-level position that is a cabinet-level position in Department of Peace. We, as the U.S. Institute of Peace, are envisioned as part of that legislation. And our president would tell you, of the Institute would say, we are very comfortable where we are. We're very effective at where we are. We're very creative at where we are. We actually are better operating outside of that sphere than within that executive branch of government. If there is a U.S. Department of Peace, I would ask you to consider who would be the Secretary of Peace. Consider who would be the president, and then who would be the Secretary of Peace. And then I imagine the people, I would tell you that many people in the peace community don't want a U.S. Department of Peace. Because, well, imagine what you could have as a cabinet level, right? Having said that, I think the goals and the motives of the U.S. Department of Peace, and this is my personal statement, very laudable, very important. We need to make peace ubiquitous. It needs to be everywhere. It needs to be in schools. It needs to be at the highest levels of government. But there may be other strategies. I can't tell you where it is. I know Congressman Kucinich refiled the legislation last week. I don't know who the co-sponsors are this term. I don't know if there's a comparable Senate bill yet. But
Thanks.
that's all. We're out of time. Okay. Thank you very much. And I'll be around this afternoon if you've got more questions.